Nobody noticed men like Caleb Whitmore anymore. In the frozen mountain town of Creston, he was just another exhausted widower driving an old pickup through snow-covered roads long after midnight, delivering packages for people rich enough to stay warm inside their homes while he counted every dollar left in his wallet. 4 years earlier, he had buried his wife after a brutal car accident. And ever since then, life had become an endless cycle of overdue bills, sleepless nights, and trying to be both father and mother to his little girl, Bonnie. The only thing still holding their broken family together was Rusty, the aging rescue dog who had once worked avalanche missions in the Rockies before time slowed his body but never dulled his instincts. On the night the storm arrived, the wind howled so violently it sounded like the mountains themselves were grieving. Caleb was halfway home from his final delivery when Rusty suddenly stood upright in the passenger seat and began barking toward the darkness beyond the road. "Easy, boy," Caleb muttered, but the dog was already clawing at the door, growling with a desperation Caleb had not heard in years. Then came the shape in the snow, a shadow, a hand. Blood. Caleb's headlights illuminated a woman collapsed beneath the trees, nearly buried by ice, her face bruised, lips blue from the cold. One hand clenched tightly around a blood-stained USB drive, as though dying mattered less than protecting whatever was inside it. Caleb froze when he saw tire tracks nearby leading into the forest, and fresh footprints heading back toward the road. Someone had left her there to die. Then, through the blizzard, headlights appeared in the distance. Black SUV, engine running, watching. Caleb's pulse thundered in his ears as Rusty stepped protectively in front of the woman, teeth bared into the storm. The woman's eyes fluttered open for half a second before she whispered weakly, "If they find me, they'll kill everyone," and lost consciousness in his arms. Caleb should have walked away. A poor single father with a daughter at home could not afford trouble like this. But something about the terror in her voice reminded him of the night he lost his wife, the helplessness, the regret, the unbearable feeling of arriving too late. So he carried the stranger into his truck and drove home through the blizzard, unaware that by sunrise the woman sleeping on his couch would be revealed as Madison Hale, the missing billionaire CEO at the center of the largest corporate scandal in America, and that the moment he saved her life, he had unknowingly signed his own death warrant. The winter of that year arrived early in Creston, swallowing the mountain town beneath endless sheets of snow before most people had even finished hanging their Christmas lights. By the second week of December, the roads had already become narrow tunnels of ice, carved between towering white banks, and every morning the sky looked heavy enough to collapse onto the earth. For most families in town, winter meant fireplaces, hot coffee, and gathering close together while storms passed outside their windows. For Caleb Whitmore, winter meant survival. It meant calculating how many gallons of gas he could afford before payday, deciding whether the electricity bill could wait another week, and praying the ancient pickup truck he drove through the mountains every night would survive one more delivery shift. At 38 years old, Caleb looked older than he should have. Grief had a way of carving years into a man's face faster than time ever could. The deep lines around his eyes had appeared after the funeral, after the casseroles from neighbors stopped arriving, after everyone quietly returned to their own lives while he remained trapped inside the wreckage of his own. 4 years earlier, his wife Emily had died on an icy highway less than 10 miles from home when a logging truck lost control during a snowstorm. Caleb still remembered the state trooper standing on his porch with snow melting on his hat, while Bonnie slept in the next room clutching a stuffed rabbit. Some nights he still heard the knock on the door in his dreams. Some mornings he woke believing for half a second that Emily was still beside him, only for reality to hit like cold water against his chest. Since then, life had become less about living and more about enduring. Caleb worked every job he could find in town. Overnight delivery driver, mechanic assistant, hauling firewood, repairing fences, even clearing snow from rooftops when storms buried cabins too deeply. He rarely complained because complaining didn't keep the lights on. Every dollar he earned disappeared before it even reached his hands. Groceries, gas, school supplies for Bonnie, prescription medication for Rusty's aching joints, mortgage payments on the tiny cabin Emily had loved so much before she died. The bank had already mailed him 3 warnings in red envelopes stacked unopened beside the microwave. Caleb avoided looking at them. Some fears only grew larger when you gave them attention. That night, the cold cut through his coat like knives as he stepped out of the truck behind Larson's grocery to unload a shipment of boxes. Snow crunched beneath his boots while the wind pushed icy needles against his face. Rusty waited inside the cab, his old brown eyes watching Caleb through the fogged windshield. The dog used to leap out of trucks with the energy of a wolf, but age had slowed him now. Gray fur covered his muzzle, and arthritis stiffened his back legs whenever temperatures dropped. Still, Rusty never left Caleb alone during night routes. The old rescue dog had belonged to a mountain search and rescue unit years earlier, before retiring after an avalanche injury. Caleb had adopted him from a shelter shortly after Emily's death, back when silence inside the house had become unbearable. Somehow the dog understood grief. Maybe that was why they trusted each other so easily. "You hanging in there, old man?" Caleb asked quietly after climbing back into the truck. Rusty responded by resting his head against Caleb's arm. Caleb smiled faintly despite the exhaustion crushing his body. "Yeah," he whispered. "Me too." His phone buzzed again, another overdue payment notification. He stared at the screen for several seconds before locking it without reading the full message. $27 left in checking. Payday still 3 days away. He exhaled slowly and started the engine. The heater barely worked anymore, coughing weak bursts of lukewarm air through dusty vents while the windshield rattled beneath the wind outside. The road home twisted through miles of frozen forest where pine trees bent under thick snow and darkness swallowed everything beyond the headlights. Caleb usually liked driving at night because the mountains felt honest in the dark. Quiet. Empty. They didn't ask questions about whether he was coping or moving on or dating again, like people in town sometimes did with uncomfortable sympathy in their eyes. Up here, there was only silence and survival. When he finally pulled into the narrow dirt driveway nearly an hour later, the porch light of the cabin glowed weakly against the storm. Caleb's chest tightened the way it always did when he saw Bonnie waiting for him. Through the frosted window, he could make out her tiny silhouette curled beneath blankets on the couch, even though it was nearly midnight. "Kid should be asleep," he muttered tiredly. But Bonnie always waited up when storms got bad. She never admitted it directly, yet Caleb knew she worried every time he drove through the mountains at night. He stepped inside quietly, stamping snow from his boots while warmth from the wood stove wrapped around him like exhausted arms. The cabin was small and worn down, with peeling paint near the kitchen ceiling and floorboards that creaked loudly during winter. But Emily had once filled it with enough laughter to make it feel rich. Caleb still hadn't changed much since she died. Her old ceramic mugs remained hanging beside the sink. Her faded knitted blanket still rested across the armchair near the fireplace. Even her winter coat remained inside the hallway closet, because Caleb could never bring himself to move it. Bonnie stirred awake on the couch as soon as the door closed. "Daddy," she mumbled sleepily, rubbing her eyes. "Hey, Bug," Caleb said softly. "I told you not to wait up." "The wind sounded scary." He crossed the room and knelt beside her, brushing tangled blonde hair from her face. Bonnie looked so much like Emily sometimes it physically hurt to breathe. Same eyes, same stubborn chin, same tiny wrinkle above her nose whenever she worried. "I'm home," he whispered. "Everything's okay." Bonnie studied him carefully. "Did you eat dinner?" Caleb forced a smile. "Of course." She narrowed her eyes immediately. "That means no." He laughed quietly under his breath because Emily used to do the exact same thing. Bonnie slid off the couch and walked toward the tiny kitchen. "I saved you chili," she announced. "And don't lie this time because Rusty already told me you skipped lunch, too." Caleb looked toward the dog lying beside the stove. Traitor. Rusty thumped his tail once against the floor. Bonnie reheated the chili while Caleb removed his boots near the door. His muscles ached from the cold so deeply he could barely straighten his back. He tried not to let Bonnie notice. Children who lost one parent too early learn to fear losing the other. While she prepared food, Caleb glanced toward the stack of unpaid bills near the sink. Electricity, water, mortgage, medical debt from Emily's hospital stay that insurance never fully covered. Sometimes the numbers terrified him more than the mountains did. Bonnie carried over the steaming bowl carefully and sat beside him while he ate. "Mrs. Hargrove says I draw better than anyone in class," she said proudly. "Really?" Caleb asked. "What'd you draw?" "You and Rusty." "Did you make me handsome at least?" Bonnie giggled for the first time all day. That sound alone made every miserable hour worth surviving. Caleb would have walked through blizzards barefoot if it meant protecting that laugh. Later that night, after Bonnie finally fell asleep in her room, Caleb remained sitting alone beside the dying fire. The cabin creaked softly beneath the storm outside while Rusty rested near his feet. Caleb stared at an old photograph on the mantel showing Emily bundled in winter clothes, smiling with snowflakes tangled in her dark hair. The picture had been taken only 2 weeks before the accident. Sometimes Caleb hated himself because parts of her voice were beginning to fade in his memory. He remembered the shape of her smile perfectly, but struggled now to remember how her laughter sounded across a room. Grief changed over time. At first it felt like drowning. Later it became quieter, heavier, like carrying a stone inside your chest every hour of every day. Caleb rubbed his eyes wearily. "I'm trying, Em," he whispered toward the photograph. "God knows I'm trying." Rusty lifted his head at the sound of his voice and slowly walked over, resting beside Caleb's chair. Caleb reached down absent-mindedly, fingers sinking into the dog's aging fur. "You're all I got left some days, buddy." Outside, the wind roared harder against the cabin walls. Snow battered the windows violently enough to shake the glass. Another storm moving in. Another dangerous night waiting tomorrow. Caleb knew he should sleep, but anxiety sat too heavily in his chest. He thought about the bank, about Bonnie needing new winter boots soon, about the strange exhaustion in his bones lately that no amount of sleep seemed able to fix. Mostly he thought about failure, the quiet fear that maybe love alone was not enough to keep a family alive. Yet every morning he still woke before sunrise, still packed Bonnie's lunch, still drove dangerous mountain roads while half the town slept safely in warm beds. Because fathers like Caleb Whitmore didn't get the luxury of falling apart. They survived because someone smaller depended on them to keep surviving too. Near 2 in the morning, the fire finally burned low enough for cold to creep back into the room. Caleb stood stiffly and checked on Bonnie one last time before heading toward bed. She slept curled beneath blankets with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm and the hallway light still on because darkness frightened her after Emily died. Caleb gently pulled the blanket higher over her shoulders. For a moment, he simply stood there watching his daughter breathe, listening to the storm rage outside the cabin while everything inside remained fragile and warm and heartbreakingly small. He did not know that within 24 hours, a bloodied stranger would crash into their lives like lightning through dry timber. He did not know powerful men were already moving through the mountains, searching for something worth killing over. All Caleb Whitmore knew that night was this: winter was growing colder, money was running out, and tomorrow he would wake before dawn and do it all over again, because that was what love looked like when nobody was watching. By sunrise, the storm had buried nearly half the town beneath fresh snow, and the cabin windows glowed pale blue beneath the weak winter light creeping through the mountains of Creston. Caleb Whitmore had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's blood in the snow and the black SUV idling between the trees like some patient predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He sat at the kitchen table with an untouched cup of coffee growing cold between his hands, while Rusty stood alert near the living room, refusing to take his eyes off the stranger sleeping beneath blankets on the sofa. The dog's instincts unsettled Caleb more than anything else. Rusty had spent years detecting danger before humans ever noticed it, and since bringing the woman home, the old rescue dog had not relaxed once. The television murmured quietly in the background while Bonnie still slept upstairs, and then suddenly the morning news interrupted regular programming with a flashing red banner across the screen. Breaking news! Caleb looked up just as the face of the woman from his couch appeared beside the reporter. Even bruised and pale from blood loss, there was no mistaking her now. Madison Hale, CEO of Helixer Biotech, billionaire, one of the most recognizable women in America, missing for 36 hours. Federal authorities continue searching for Madison Hale after her private vehicle was discovered abandoned near Denver late Tuesday night, the reporter announced. Sources close to the investigation suggest Hale may have been connected to an internal dispute involving confidential corporate data. Authorities warn the public not to approach anyone believed to be assisting her. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Rusty growled low in his throat at the sound of the television. On the couch, Madison suddenly jerked awake in panic, breathing hard as though she had surfaced from drowning. Her eyes darted wildly across the room before landing on the screen. Fear, unlike anything Caleb had ever seen, crossed her face. Not fear of being caught, fear of what would happen if she was. "Turn it off," she rasped immediately. Caleb grabbed the remote. Silence swallowed the cabin. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Madison slowly tried to sit upright, but winced sharply from pain near her ribs. Dried blood stained the bandages Bonnie had wrapped around her shoulder during the night. "You need a hospital," Caleb said carefully. Madison shook her head so fast it startled him. "No hospitals, no police. You're on national news. That's exactly why I can't go." Caleb stared at her, exhaustion and suspicion colliding inside him. "Who the hell are you running from?" Madison looked toward the window first before answering, as though expecting someone to already be watching from outside. People with enough money to erase entire lives. Caleb almost laughed at the absurdity of it, except something in her expression stopped him. She looked genuinely terrified. Not dramatic, not paranoid, terrified. Bonnie's small footsteps echoed from upstairs before either adult could continue. "Daddy," she called sleepily. Madison immediately stiffened. Caleb lowered his voice. "Easy, it's my daughter." Bonnie appeared in oversized pajamas holding her stuffed rabbit, then froze when she saw Madison awake. "Oh," she whispered. "You're alive." Despite everything, Madison almost smiled at that. Bonnie walked closer cautiously. "Do you still hurt?" Madison hesitated before nodding once. Bonnie placed the rabbit beside her. "When I'm scared, Mr. Pickles helps." Caleb watched something flicker across Madison's face then, something soft and painful at the same time. For a moment, she looked less like a billionaire executive and more like a human being who had forgotten what kindness felt like. Then Rusty suddenly barked sharply toward the front window. Every muscle in Caleb's body tightened instantly. The dog never barked without reason. Caleb moved to the curtains carefully and peeked outside. Fresh tire tracks cut through the snow near the road below the cabin. Black tracks. Recent. His pulse quickened. "Stay here," he muttered. He grabbed his coat and stepped onto the porch. The cold slapped him hard across the face while snow drifted sideways through the trees. At first the road looked empty. Then he saw it. Far down the hill beyond the pines, partially hidden behind blowing snow, sat a dark SUV with tinted windows. Engine running, motionless, watching the cabin. Caleb's stomach dropped. The vehicle remained there for only a few seconds before slowly reversing back into the storm and disappearing around the bend. Caleb hurried back inside immediately, locking the door behind him. "Someone's here," he said. Madison closed her eyes briefly like she had expected this all along. "They found me faster than I thought." "Who are they?" Caleb snapped, anger finally breaking through his fear. "You brought something dangerous into my house. I got a little girl here." Madison looked directly at Bonnie before answering. "I know." Then she slowly opened her hand. The blood-stained USB drive rested in her palm. "And if they get this back, more people will die." Silence filled the room. Caleb stared at the tiny drive like it might explode. "What's on it?" Madison swallowed hard. "Proof." "Proof of what?" Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. 42 deaths. Caleb felt the cabin suddenly grow colder. Madison explained in fragments at first, as though even speaking the truth aloud terrified her. Helixor Biotech had spent years developing a breakthrough neurological treatment expected to make billions. Investors, politicians, pharmaceutical partners, everyone wanted the drug approved before competitors could catch up. Clinical trials were rushed, safety concerns buried, internal reports altered. Patients died quietly during testing phases. But executives classified the deaths as unrelated complications to keep federal regulators away. 42 people in total. 42 families told lies while the company prepared for launch. Caleb listened in stunned silence while Bonnie sat quietly clutching Rusty's fur near the fireplace, too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize fear in adults. "Why keep this?" Caleb asked finally. Madison's eyes filled with something darker than fear. Guilt. "Because I signed some of the approvals." The words hung heavily in the room. "At first I believed them when they said the risks were manageable. Then people started dying faster. Every time I pushed for delays, the board threatened lawsuits, investors, everything. They said if the company collapsed, thousands would lose jobs. So I kept compromising until I realized what we'd become." She looked down at the USB. "This contains every hidden report, every altered autopsy, every payment made to silence families." Caleb rubbed a hand across his face. "Jesus." "I tried taking it to the authorities," Madison whispered. "Someone inside the company warned them first." A sudden sound interrupted her. Crunch. Outside. Close. Rusty lunged toward the back door, snarling violently. Caleb immediately killed the lights. The cabin fell into darkness except for pale snowlight through the windows. Everyone froze. Another sound followed. Footsteps. Moving slowly around the cabin. Caleb's heart pounded so hard he could hear it. Bonnie grabbed his sleeve tightly. "Daddy." "Quiet, Bug." The footsteps stopped near the kitchen window. Then came the soft, metallic click of someone testing the door handle outside. Madison's breathing became ragged with panic. Caleb motioned everyone lower behind the counter while Rusty stood rigid beside the door, teeth exposed. Another click. Then silence. Caleb reached carefully beneath the sink and pulled out the old shotgun he kept for mountain lions during winter roots. His hands trembled slightly despite himself. Minutes passed. Nothing. No movement. No voices. Only the storm outside. Then suddenly headlights flooded through the front windows. Caleb spun toward the porch, shotgun raised. A police cruiser rolled into the driveway. Relief almost hit him before he recognized the sheriff stepping out. Sheriff Dean Mercer. Tall, gray beard, friendly smile everyone in town trusted. Mercer knocked heavily on the door. "Caleb, you home?" Caleb hesitated. Something felt wrong. Mercer glanced toward the tree line briefly before knocking again. "Your truck was spotted near County Road 7 last night," he called. "Need to ask a few questions about a missing woman." Madison's face went white. Caleb lowered his voice. "Did you tell anybody about me?" "No." Another knock, harder now. "Caleb, Caleb slowly approached the door but did not unlock it. "Morning, Sheriff." Mercer smiled through the storm. "Mind if I come in?" Caleb studied him carefully. Snow clung to Mercer's shoulders, but his boots were strangely clean for someone driving through back roads after a blizzard. Then Caleb noticed something else. Black tire marks behind the cruiser, fresh, similar width to the SUV outside earlier. Mercer's eyes drifted subtly past Caleb's shoulder into the cabin, searching. Caleb's instincts sharpened instantly. "Bonnie's sick," he lied. "Trying not to let cold air in." Mercer's smile faded slightly. "You see anybody unusual last night?" Caleb forced himself not to glance backward. "Nope." Mercer stared at him for a long moment, too long. Then he nodded once. "Well, if you do, call me immediately. Woman's dangerous." As Mercer turned away, Rusty suddenly growled deep and low from inside the cabin. The sheriff paused. Slowly, his eyes lifted toward the sound. For one horrifying second, Caleb thought everything was over. Then Mercer smiled again. "Take care of that old dog," he said softly. "Storm's only getting worse." He drove away moments later, but Caleb continued staring through the window long after the cruiser disappeared. Every instinct screamed the same warning now. They were being watched from every direction. And worse than that, Caleb no longer knew who he could trust. The storm trapped them inside the cabin for the next 2 days, sealing the roads beneath walls of snow and cutting off most of the town from the outside world. In another life, Madison Hale would have hated a place like this. The cabin was too small, too cold, too quiet, compared to the glass towers and luxury penthouses that had defined her world for years. The roof creaked whenever the wind struck too hard, the kitchen sink leaked constantly, and the old wood stove filled the rooms with the scent of smoke, no matter how carefully Caleb Whitmore cleaned it. Yet somewhere between the rattling windows and the soft glow of firelight, something inside her slowly began to unravel in a way she had not expected. The first morning after Sheriff Mercer's visit, Madison woke to the sound of laughter. Real laughter, small and bright and innocent. She opened her eyes carefully from the couch and saw Bonnie sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Rusty, with crayons spread everywhere around them. Bonnie had tied one of her old scarves around Rusty's neck like a cape, while the old dog endured the humiliation with tired patience. "He's super rusty," Bonnie explained seriously when she noticed Madison watching. "He saves people in storms." Madison blinked for a second before an unexpected laugh escaped her throat. It startled even her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed naturally. In her world, every smile had become strategic years ago, something practiced during interviews, shareholder meetings, charity galas, political dinners. But this laugh came from somewhere deeper, somewhere she thought had disappeared long ago. Bonnie immediately grinned. "See? I told Daddy you looked nicer when you smiled." Caleb nearly choked on his coffee from the kitchen counter. "Bonnie!" "What? It's true." Madison shook her head softly, still smiling despite herself. "No one said something honest to me in a very long time." Bonnie frowned at that as though she could not understand how such a thing was possible. Maybe children were the only people left who still believed adults deserved honesty. Throughout the day, Caleb repaired loose boards near the back porch, while Madison rested on the couch recovering from her injuries. She watched him through the frost-covered window as snow drifted across the mountains behind him. There was something painfully steady about the way Caleb moved through life. He never wasted energy complaining. He simply endured whatever hardship arrived next because someone depended on him to keep going. Madison had spent years surrounded by wealthy men who measured strength through power, influence, or money. Yet none of them felt half as strong as this exhausted widower patching his own porch in sub-zero weather because hiring help cost too much. That evening, Bonnie insisted they all eat dinner together at the tiny kitchen table. The meal itself was simple: cheap canned soup stretched with potatoes, and leftover bread toasted near the fire. But Bonnie treated it like a holiday feast. "No phones allowed," she declared proudly before remembering Madison no longer had one. Caleb almost smiled into his bowl. For the first time since arriving, Madison noticed how carefully Caleb hid his exhaustion from his daughter. He always let Bonnie eat first, always pretended he was full when there was little food left, always smiled before she looked his way, even when worry still lingered in his eyes afterward. It reminded Madison painfully of her own father, a mechanic in Missouri who worked double shifts his entire life to keep food on their table before cancer buried him beneath hospital debt when she was 19. She had spent so many years running from that frightened poor girl that she barely recognized her anymore. Bonnie suddenly pointed toward the old photograph sitting on the mantel above the fireplace. "That's my mom." Madison turned toward the picture of Emily Whitmore smiling beneath falling snow. "She was beautiful," Madison said quietly. Caleb lowered his gaze immediately. The warmth around the table dimmed for half a second. Bonnie nodded. "Daddy says she could make anyone laugh." Caleb cleared his throat roughly. "She could." Bonnie looked toward Madison curiously. "Do you have kids?" The question landed harder than Madison expected. She hesitated too long before answering. "No." Bonnie tilted her head innocently. "Didn't you want any?" Madison stared down at her soup. Once, many years ago, she had wanted a family desperately. Before Helixer consumed every piece of her life. Before 70-hour work weeks turned into normal routines. Before ambition slowly replaced human connection, until she woke one day inside a luxury penthouse, realizing there was nobody left she trusted enough to call when things fell apart. "I thought I had more time," she admitted softly. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Sad silence. Caleb finally spoke without looking up. "Life does that sometimes." Madison looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the loneliness hiding beneath his calm exterior. It lived in the quiet pauses after Emily's name came up, in the way he stared at empty spaces without realizing it, in how carefully he avoided discussing the future, as though planning too far ahead only invited loss. Later that night, the power failed completely when heavy ice knocked down lines outside town. Darkness swallowed the cabin except for the fire crackling softly in the wood stove and the glow of lantern light across the walls. Bonnie immediately dragged blankets into the living room. "Campfire night," she announced excitedly. Caleb groaned playfully. "You just like excuses to stay up late." "Correct." Madison sat wrapped in blankets near the fire while Bonnie leaned against Rusty, who snored softly beside her. Wind roared outside the cabin, shaking snow loose from the roof. But inside the tiny room, everything felt strangely warm, despite the cold pressing against the windows. Bonnie convinced Caleb to tell old rescue stories from his younger days in mountain search and rescue. Madison listened quietly while he described avalanche missions, lost hikers, and nights spent searching frozen forests with Rusty long before the dog retired. "Rusty once found a missing little boy buried under snow," Bonnie added proudly. "Daddy says he saved him before rescuers even knew where to dig." Madison looked at the old dog sleeping beside the fire. "Sounds like a hero." Caleb scratched Rusty gently behind the ears. "Best partner I ever had." Rusty opened one eye briefly at the sound of his name before placing his head heavily against Caleb's boot again. The simple affection between them struck Madison harder than she expected. In her world, loyalty had always come with conditions, contracts, benefits, strategy. Yet here, inside this tiny cabin hidden in the mountains, love existed in its purest form. Quiet acts repeated every day without expecting anything in return. Bonnie eventually fell asleep against Madison's shoulder halfway through a story. Madison froze slightly at first, uncertain what to do. Bonnie's small hand remained curled gently around the fabric of her sleeve, while her breathing slowed into dreams. Caleb looked over from his chair across the fire. For a moment, neither adult spoke. The firelight reflected softly in Madison's eyes while snow battered the windows behind them. "She trusts you," Caleb said quietly. Madison glanced down at Bonnie resting beside her. "I don't deserve that." Caleb studied her for a long moment. "Maybe none of us do." Something shifted inside Madison then. Something dangerous. Hope. Because for the first time in years, she no longer felt like a CEO hiding behind armor made of money and power. She felt human again. Broken, guilty, exhausted, but human. Outside, somewhere deep in the mountains surrounding Creston, men were still searching through the storm with weapons, money, and orders to recover the missing USB at any cost. But inside the cabin, beside a sleeping child, an old rescue dog, and a grieving father who still chose kindness despite everything life had taken from him, Madison Hale experienced something she had not felt in years. Home. The final storm arrived just before dawn, swallowing the mountains of Creston beneath violent winds and white darkness as black SUVs climbed the frozen road toward the cabin. Caleb Whitmore stood near the window with the old shotgun in his hands, while Bonnie slept upstairs, unaware that armed men were moving through the snow outside. Across the room, Madison Hale stared at the blood-stained USB drive resting in her trembling hands. 42 people were dead because powerful men believed money mattered more than human lives, and now those same men were willing to bury anyone who threatened the truth. Caleb looked at Madison quietly. "If you run now, they'll keep hunting you forever." Madison lowered her eyes. "And if I stay, your daughter could die because of me." Caleb thought about the years after Emily's death, about all the nights he felt powerless watching life tear pieces away from the people he loved. Then he looked toward Bonnie's room upstairs. "I spent too long teaching my little girl that good people help others," he said softly. "Can't betray that now." Outside, headlights appeared through the storm. The men had found them. Everything after that happened fast. Glass shattered, gunfire exploded through the cabin walls. Caleb pushed Madison and Bonnie toward the back door while snow and splinters filled the air. Rusty barked furiously, positioning himself between the family and the intruders like he had done during rescue missions years ago. Madison finally made her choice in that moment. No more hiding, no more compromise. Through shaking hands, she transmitted every file from the USB to a national investigative reporter moments before the cabin lost power completely. Within minutes, the evidence exposing Helixor Biotech, the hidden clinical deaths, and the conspiracy protecting them began spreading across national media. The truth could no longer be buried. But justice came with a cost. As Caleb rushed Bonnie through the snow toward the trees, a gunshot cracked through the storm. Rusty lunged without hesitation, throwing himself between Caleb and the bullet. The old rescue dog collapsed into the snow with a painful whimper that seemed to silence the entire mountain. "Rusty!" Bonnie screamed. Caleb dropped to his knees beside him while snow covered the dog's silver fur. Rusty weakly lifted his head one final time, pressing against Caleb's hand exactly the way he always had after long nights on the road. Then slowly, peacefully, he stopped breathing. Caleb lowered his forehead against the dog's fur while tears disappeared into the falling snow. By sunrise, federal agents flooded the mountains. Arrests spread across the country. Helixor Biotech collapsed within days. Months later, spring finally returned to Creston. Near the cabin, Bonnie planted wildflowers beside a small wooden marker overlooking the mountains Rusty once searched. Madison, no longer a CEO, visited often. And some evenings, when the wind moved softly through the trees and the world finally felt quiet again, Caleb would sit beside his daughter beneath the fading sunlight and realize something extraordinary. Even broken people could still save lives. Because real heroes were not always rich or powerful. Sometimes they were just poor single fathers, driving old pickup trucks through winter storms, refusing to leave another human being alone in the cold.